going to move on, and for the sake of time, really, and I would like to now introduce John McGeady, who is the Justice Officer. Hold on, I've just lost my place. This happens just when I needed it most. Excuse me 1 minute. Yeah, John McGeady, who is the Justice Officer with the Sisters of Our Lady of Apostles. He is the OLA representative on and the current chairperson of the Irish antenna of the Africa Faith and Justice Network. John is going to speak to us about corporate accountability legislation presently before the EU and how each of us can support strengthening this proposed law. So, John, I hand over the floor to you.
Thanks very much, Brian. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, John, thank you.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah.
And thanks very much as well to Fidelma and to Isaac for your contributions. I think you really illuminated what the sort of corporate abuses that we're talking about looks like in specific cases and in specific places. And it's great to have the local here in Tyrone, here in Ireland, and the global in other communities in northern Uganda for us to get a full picture of what's going on. So one of the things that came up time and again, and it came up in the documentary produced by Trocra, was the idea that we need mandatory legislation. And there is presently a draft legislation before the European Union, which is intended to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. This is the proposed EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Okay, so this is proposed legislation presently before the European Union. Now, this legislation will require corporations operating in the EU to conduct due diligence across their entire value chain. So in other words, the responsibility will be on the corporations to check that none of their business partners, for example, maybe their suppliers, are engaged in human rights abuses or violations. And they'll no longer be able to plead ignorance to say, oh, well, we didn't know, it's nothing to do with us. That was another company. When we bought for them, we didn't know that they were violating human rights. They'll have to now conduct that human rights due diligence, just the same way that they have to conduct financial due diligence whenever they engage with a supplier or a business partner or seek investment. So when we speak about value chains, this is a word that came up in the documentary, and it might be good to explain it. We're not just talking about the supply chain. What we really mean is every single business relationship or transaction that's involved in producing a good or a service. So that could be from growing crops or mining the minerals, like we've heard this evening, to processing, shipping, manufacturing, advertising, and retailing. So from an idea all the way through to selling something to a customer, every single activity or relationship or action involved in that process, that's the entire value chain of a good or a service. So this law will require EU companies to ensure that at no point are goods or services that they produce, or the material or the labor involved at any stage, contaminated by human rights abuses. Now, this process is making, the process of making law in the European Union involves the three branches of the EU, which is the Commission, who proposed the legislation, the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers, both of whom then negotiate the passage of that legislation to ensure that it's acceptable to all parties. Now, this draft directive that we're talking about was proposed by the European Commission in February of this year, of 2022. The next stage following it being proposed has been completed. And that's the stage where the Council of Ministers, representing the governments of the member states, review and amend the legislation, and they've just done that. So Ireland was represented by Minister of State Dara Calleary, and before him, Robert Troy, on the Council of Ministers. And the Council have amended the text, and now it goes before the Parliament. Now, unfortunately, the Commission's draft of the text of the Due Diligence Directive has been weakened by the Council. They agreed the Council's general approach last week on the 1st of December. And the changes they've made have weakened this legislation to make it easier for corporations to work around it or ignore it. What they've done particularly is they've excluded the financial sector, so that it'll be up to every member state to decide whether or not they apply the legislation to the financial sector. But of course, the financial sector is really crucial to this, because if a company is committing human rights abuses, and if it cannot get funding or can't get lending or loans from banks, then it'll have to change its ways. So it's really, really important that the financial sector is actually included in this legislation. And what happens is, because it's every country will have the discretion to include a financial sector. Of course, none of them will, because they'll only be placing their own financial sector at a disadvantage compared to the other European financial sectors. Likewise, there's been a change of language in the legislation to move from value chains, which cover everything, to simply what they call chains of activity, which is a much more limited understanding of the legislation. Now, these last-minute changes were unfortunately initiated by France, and they gained the support of the majority of the EU member states last Thursday. And in fairness to the Irish government and to Minister Dara Calleary, the Irish government were not in favour of the proposed changes made by the French government. Nonetheless, the weakened text is now adopted and will become the European Council's position during the forthcoming negotiations with the Commission and with the Parliament. The European Parliament will now prepare to deliberate the Commission's text in the new year. But this provides us, as citizens of the European Union, with an opportunity. We now have an opportunity to influence this legislation, to take an action, and to write to our MEPs, to our members of the European Parliament, and request that they advocate for robust legislation. So one of the things we're asking you to do this evening is to sign a letter that we are going to share all with you. Michelle, actually, if you want to screen share the letter there. We've prepared a draft letter that you can send to your MEPs. In fact, you can send it to every single MEP in Ireland, and you can send it to MEPs in other countries in the European Union as well. Send as many as you like, and we encourage you to send as many as you want. But the letter simply asks that you would asks that the MEP would support stronger legislation, and that basically they would strengthen it and beef it up. Michelle, you might just expand the size there from 100% up to maybe 120 or 150 to make it a little bit easier to read. Now, I won't read through the letter now, okay? I've more or less explained what's in it, but what I will say are that the key things that are being asked for, and they are to make the inclusion of the financial sector mandatory, and to restore the language of value chains rather than the more limited language of chains of activity. The second thing is to increase the scope of companies that will be included in the legislation. Presently, 99% of businesses in the European Union will not actually be covered by this legislation. So it's not very effective at present, so that needs to be increased. Obviously, not all businesses need to be covered. We're not talking about small businesses, but businesses of a certain size who have a certain reach and a certain weight need to be covered by this legislation. It also needs to enable justice for victims. Okay, there are significant barriers to the ability of communities to take complex and expensive cases against your corporations in the EU. So, you know, that needs to be facilitated more clearly to allow people to actually be able to bring cases. And finally, you need to ask that your MEP address the dangerous loopholes. You know, many companies could try to avoid court cases through signing contractual clauses with suppliers and so forth. So this is really what this letter asks for. And what this letter really is trying to do, it's trying to respond to the issues raised in the documentary produced by Trócaire, and it's also trying to respond to the issues raised by Fidelma and Isaac this evening, recognizing that while corporations may not necessarily be out to do evil, and they may not be the ones necessarily in violation of certain human rights, they may be doing business with others who are. And in doing business with people who are abusing human rights, and by ignoring it and turning a blind eye to it, it means that our entire economic system is being contaminated with these injustices. And I should say, it's not just human rights abuses, it's also, as Fidelma and as Isaac pointed out, environmental abuses. And I suppose in that respect, I would just maybe draw attention once again to Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, where he says very clearly, we're not faced with two separate crises. We're faced with one crisis that has two elements to it, two sides to it, one ecological and the other social. And I hope that's maybe what you take away this evening. So what we'll do with that piece of, with that letter, is we'll pop it into the chat, and you can download it right away. We'll also send it in a follow-up email to everybody who's registered. And of course, if you're on the call tonight, it means you registered to be on the call. So we have your email address and we'll forward it to you in the follow-up email. You'll see there's a section in red for you to put in your own address and for you to put in the MEP's address. We also have a copy of all of the addresses of the Irish MEPs, and we'll send those to you as well. So you're able to apply whichever MEP's address you want to apply. And of course, then your signature at the bottom. This is a draft or a template letter, so don't feel obliged to stick to it word for word. If you want to rewrite it in your own words, by all means. But we just want to make it as easy for you as possible. And hopefully you agree with the sentiments in the letter, and you'll want to send it. So we'll send that to you in the follow-up email, but it is in the chat that you can download it now as well. So I hope that's clear. Can I ask, are there any questions from anybody of maybe how you should go about doing this or anything else? Please do let me know. Well, I don't think there are any questions. One thing I would just ask is the following. It came up recently in a conversation about sending a letter versus sending an email, and somebody said, well, nobody sends letters anymore. But interestingly enough, generally speaking, emails get ignored, letters don't. So I would advise, while you can send it as an email, if you can, print it and sign it and stick it in a letter and physically post it, that would be far, far more impactful. So, I would strongly encourage that if you're going to send it, do send it by post. Okay, I think that's it from me, unless there are any other questions. Okay, over to you again, Brian. Thanks very much.
Thank you indeed. Thanks very much indeed, John. Plenty to take on board there, and you have the letter, and as John says, you can make it your own. But the one thing I suppose John is urging us to do is not to send it as an email, to download it, read it, print it, put a stamp on it, and send it to the minister. So that's in the chat, and as John said too, it will be followed up in the email that follows on.
I might just come in there, Brian. I just see a question or a comment came in from Miriam.
Go ahead.
She made the point that and I actually saw Miriam at a recent webinar we ran as well, that she's already sent this letter. And I would just say that you've sent a similar letter, but this has actually changed. So this process, the process of making legislation, is always moving. It's always shifting, particularly at the European Union level, because there are 3 different branches involved: the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. If you look at the letter, there is I'm just going to bring it up here. The second paragraph. Anybody who's already sent a letter or has been on an AFGN webinar and sent a similar letter, if you want to remove the second paragraph and just write in your own sentence or two saying that you had previously written to them on this topic and you're writing to them again to follow up, because something important happened last week, which was the European Commission, or rather the European Council of Ministers, agreed its position. And in agreeing its position, it unfortunately, as I said, weakened the legislation. So by sending this letter now, not to the minister, but to the MEPs, you're drawing their attention to this fact, the fact that you're unhappy that the legislation has been weakened, and that in light of this, you're asking them to strengthen it again now through the European Parliament. So if anybody has sent it, and I really appreciate, by the way, to Miriam and others who have been on previous webinars, we really do appreciate people who have already contacted either Minister Robert Troy when he was Minister, or Minister Dara Cleary, or MEPs on this issue. But if you would contact them again, because it's important to maintain that dialogue with your MEPs so that they know, A, this is something that matters to our constituents, and B, it matters enough to them that they're keeping on with the dialogue and they're following up with us and they're paying attention to what's happening in the process and they're responding to that. So that would be my suggestion here. So again, if you want to maybe remove that second paragraph and add in just a line or two saying that you've sent them a letter previously on whatever date it was that you sent it, and that you're sending this email as a follow-up based on the recent decision by the Council of Ministers.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, John, and thanks indeed, Miriam, for drawing our attention to that. Do you know, I suppose as time is moving on now, we're heading almost for 9 o'clock, so we're a couple of minutes over. But what we'll do now really is we'll wind down the webinar. And before I do so, I would really like to thank, in particular, I would like to thank Fidelma O'Kane and Isaac, who also spoke to us this evening, and also to let you know that we will share all of their content with you. I'd like to thank Tony from AMRI, who spoke first. I'd like to thank John from the OLA and from AEFJN for his contribution there that you have heard, and his call to action, I suppose. And he was referenced also in terms of the UPR in the United Kingdom. I'd also like to thank Michelle Robertson, who's in the background there making all of this happen. She is the communications officer for the SMA and the OLA, and also to Jerry Ford, who's online, who was very much involved in the preparations for all of this, for this webinar. Before we leave you though, we would like to invite any interested religious congregations to join with AEFJN. We are 9 congregations as we stand, but we are looking for more. And as Sheila Curran mentioned when she commented, there is a global reach that the Catholic Church has, and it is something that we act upon. And indeed, the Catholic Church work where governments don't. They have an experience and a weight to that experience that carries and has a voice that can be heard. And we're using that to try and activate and to try and create an awareness around some of the issues that are, if you like, coming to the fore as part of AEFJN and as part of AMRI. So if you would like to screen this documentary for schools or communities or other settings, then we would ask that you might contact us, and we'll do our best to help you in any way that we can. So I suppose as we head for Christmas, this season of Advent, we're being reminded again, as John mentioned, Pope Francis in Laudato Si, in his letter to all of us, Laudato Si, there is a challenge or a call to action when he says, perhaps when I find moments to stand still, or better, sit, maybe the issue I am not using any of the time reflecting on how I might better help a threatened natural order and neglected people, then I could put those reflections into actions with others and resist being rapidified. So if ever there was a call to action. So I leave you with that message, and thank you once again, one and all, speakers, organisers, and those who turned up in your number, and we will be in contact again before Christmas, please God, with the detail of this webinar and more. So thank you all once again.